What up, YouTube? Here with a post-fight video for Day of Reckoning. There was multiple fights of a headline magnitude on this card, and feature bouts that was highlighted for this event was top-notch, and it was a good way to close out the year of 2023. Now, boxing had a real successful year this past year of 2023. Looking forward to better and bigger things for this year of 2024. And if they put on cards like Day of Reckoning that we saw a week ago, then boxing would be at a good, healthy, revitalizing state. And this was a good indicator of brighter things to come ahead in the sport of boxing. And I'm going to review all the fights that I saw that happened on this card. First, I'll talk about the main event. That was Anthony Joshua taking on Otto Wallin. I had expected this fight to be more closer than the Deyontay Wilder and Joseph Parker fight. Now, on paper, both of those fights seemed like competitive bouts on paper, stylistically speaking, as well as experience-wise. Because you look at Otto Wallin, I would say, other than the fight that Tyson Fury had versus Francis Ngannou, that being his most recent fight, and that was the most competitive fight that Tyson Fury had since fighting Deontay Wilder the first time, because the other two fights wasn't close. And Otto Wallin gave Tyson Fury a heck of a challenge when they fought. And Otto Wallin, he displayed good technical skills in that fight versus a very well-skilled fighter like Tyson Fury. Hence why Anthony Joshua, who's been criticized for his lack of fundamentals, that's why I had thought that that fight on paper could have been very troubling for Anthony Joshua. You look at his fight versus Alexander Usyk, and he fought Usyk twice for the unified heavyweight titles, and those two losses that he suffered versus Alexander Usyk in the two fights that they had were the only decision losses that Anthony Joshua had on his record. And that came from a skillful fighter who is technically sound like Alexander Usyk, and Otto Wallin being a technical fighter as well could have been a tough challenge and a tough task for Anthony Joshua to get a victory over on. And Anthony Joshua, ever since his two defeats that he suffered versus Alexander Usyk, he's been showing more improvements when it comes to his fundamental skills. He's shown that he's improved on patience, he's improved on placing his punches better, and he's improved on timing and telegraphing his opponents. And overall, he's showing improvements on being more technically sound when it comes to pure boxing skills. And Anthony Joshua, he built a reputation from knocking his opponents out, and his losses along the way helped shape and mold Anthony Joshua to a better fighter. And I say that because of his performance versus Otto Wallin. You look at his most recent fights, he didn't fight, I'd say, the best quality of opponents. And with Anthony Joshua still being a stable name amongst the top of the heavyweight division, whoever he fights is gonna be a attraction bout, not only for boxing fans overall, but the public, especially out there in the UK where Anthony Joshua is from. And Anthony Joshua got the win via fifth round TKO corner stoppage. Otto Wallin's corner called a halt to the bout and didn't let Otto Wallin come out for the sixth round. And that is because Otto Wallin has suffered a broken nose. Anthony Joshua was having a field day. It was like target practice for Anthony Joshua for all 5 rounds that this fight lasted. That goes to tell y'all the results as I'm giving y'all the summary how this fight went. And as I had said, I had expected this fight to be more closer than it actually was. Anthony Joshua was accurate with his shots. He showed improvements at using feints and staying elusive and utilizing good timing and good ring generalship, good movement. As I said, he did a good job at staying elusive and keeping his head off of the center line for him to not get hit, which Otto Wallin wasn't able to do because Otto Wallin, he kept getting caught with this head being at the center line. He looked stiff, I say, and that's from witnessing his upper body movements, and his upper body movement seemed jittery, and that didn't allow him to maneuver properly for him to avoid shots that was coming from Anthony Joshua. And Anthony Joshua's jab has improved tremendously, I say, and he's showing that in his most recent fights and definitely in this fight as well. Anthony Joshua was doing a good job at working behind the jab, and that 1-2, that combination was working like a charm for him in this fight because it was accurate, it was well placed, well timed, and he was able to read the rhythm of Otto Wallin, and that's what didn't allow Otto Wallin to get in his rhythm, to get anything going for him to be successful in this fight versus Anthony Joshua. And the damage that Anthony Joshua caused on Otto Wallin goes to show he's not lacking when it comes to power in his hands. And I had this fight scored a shutout in favor of Anthony Joshua prior to the stoppage. And as I had said, Anthony Joshua, in his 3-fight win streak that he is currently on right now, and this was the best bounce-back performance Anthony Joshua put on after losing his unified heavyweight titles. And as I have said, you look at the quality of his opponents that he fought prior to fighting Otto Wallin, resume-wise speaking, is the best fighter that he fought in his last 3 fights. He defeated Jermaine Franklin in what was considered by many people as a lackluster, disappointing of a performance because it felt more like it was dragged out and Anthony Joshua could have performed better. And we've seen Anthony Joshua put on better fights in the past, even when it went the distance. And that's what I was alluding to when I said Anthony Joshua had improved on patience because he displayed that factor in that fight versus Jermaine Franklin. And Anthony Joshua, he wasn't throwing as much power shots as we're used to seeing him throw because Anthony Joshua, another part of his game that was criticized was him looking like a Goliath of a figure, muscle mass wise speaking, physically speaking. When it comes to his physical features and attributes, the guy looks like a bodybuilder, and that's why people were saying that's where his power, his knockout power comes from because of his muscle mass and the way how his body is shaped. And heavyweights, they tend to gas out quicker than the skinnier built guys and the smaller weight classes. And it's guys that are shaped like Anthony Joshua, who has more muscle than fat or any other body scientific attributes and features. They tend to gas out quicker than your average heavyweights that doesn't have as much muscle mass and tone as Anthony Joshua. And Anthony Joshua has shown struggles with his stamina before and throwing more power shots instead of boxing. And Anthony Joshua has been criticized for headhunting and being impatient and not placing his punches properly, and his punch selections as well has been criticized before. And all these attributes, he's shown improvements in his most recent fights. As I said, that fight versus Jermaine Franklin, before I got carried away with what I was talking about, he showed that he was able to be patient by not getting overzealous, not headhunting, and being more wiser with his choice of punches that he throws out there, and him being more cool and collective in that fight and sticking to the game plan instead of doing what we're used to seeing Anthony Joshua do, and that's to seek out to put on a performance that is of a fan-friendly style that got him the reputation that he still obtains till this day. And he proved that in that Jermaine Franklin fight, regardless of the fact that that fight was regarded as boring to many boxing fans, and it wasn't the most fan-friendly affair of a fight, not only on paper, but the actual fight itself wasn't the most entertaining fights of them all. And as I said, Anthony Joshua had put on much more thrilling performances in the past, and this was definitely one of those fights that isn't of a Anthony Joshua repertoire. And that's because he fought a style that we're not accustomed to seeing Anthony Joshua fight in. And Anthony Joshua had changed coaches on numerous times, and that's what I say helped him become a better fighter that we're seeing him as today, because he got to be studious by working with variety of trainers. And we saw that fight versus Robert Helenius. That fight on paper as well, despite the fact that Helenius is considered to be a veteran who's been fighting for a while now, and Helenius, I'll say, been past his prime, and that fight was to make Anthony Joshua look good. As I said, paper-wise speaking, that fight could have been compared to that Jermaine Franklin fight as far as the caliber of a threat that Robert Helenius posed to Anthony Joshua prior to the actual fight happening. And Anthony Joshua performed very well in that fight. He was successful in scoring a knockout victory over on Robert Helenius, unlike the fight he had versus Jermaine Franklin. And then he takes on Otto Wallin, who's a better opponent than both Jermaine Franklin and Robert Helenius, and he fought a better fight versus a tougher opponent than his last two opponents. And that means Anthony Joshua is back on the uppity slope. And last time that I had checked the current heavyweight rankings, according to the title organizations, he's ranked number 3 by the WBA, and number 4 or 3, he should be number 3 by the WBC, and he's number 4 ranked by the IBF and the WBO. And I don't know if it's updated now because they still have Deontay Wilder ranked amongst the top 5 heavyweights according to at least 3 of the 4 major sanctioning bodies of the heavyweight title organizations. And I'm going to talk about why the rankings when it comes to the top heavyweight contenders should be changed because of what happened at the co-main event with Deontay Wilder versus Joseph Parker. And as far as Anthony Joshua's future goes, it was rumored that Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder were supposed to fight for March this year. And I heard that they have agreed to the terms and they was going to have that fight being hosted in Saudi Arabia. As we can clearly see now that heavyweight boxing and boxing overall is starting to become marketable in Saudi Arabia. We got the undisputed heavyweight title fight being hosted in Saudi Arabia as well, with Tyson Fury taking on Alexander Usyk next month. And then this supposed fight that was scheduled to happen March of this year with Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua was supposed to be in Saudi Arabia. And Tyson Fury's most recent fight versus Francis Ngannou was hosted in Saudi Arabia as well. And Anthony Joshua's next scheduled fight is probably going to be spring of this year. And it's rumored now that he's going to fight Francis Ngannou in a exhibition of a attraction bout more than it is a legitimate heavyweight boxing fight. Francis Ngannou, since he made his pro boxing debut and he jumped onto the boxing scene and skipped the line of fighting, I would say, journeymen or boxers that fight part-time, by fighting the WBC heavyweight champion Tyson Fury. And that's because Francis Ngannou already has a reputation from his MMA career. And when you have crossover matches like a well-decorated MMA fighter, a former champion at that, versus a former champion in boxing that is already reputable, that calls for a big money bout. And that's why Francis Ngannou, and especially because he performed brilliantly versus Tyson Fury in his boxing debut, fights that are lucrative, like a fight versus Anthony Joshua, is presented to him. And from what I've heard, Anthony Joshua versus Francis Ngannou is already done. And they're expecting that fight to happen at March instead of the originally rumored bout with Joshua and Wilder, because of what took place at the co-main event on this card. And Anthony Joshua, this is a money-making opportunity for Anthony Joshua more than it is for him to prove himself and to line himself for another title shot in hopes for him to become heavyweight champion once again. And this gives him space to keep active and have his name be busy in the boxing world. And it's more of a proving ground for Francis Ngannou in that fight, because they can say Tyson Fury, he took that as if that was a sparring fight and that was a money scheme grabber for Tyson Fury rather than it was a legitimate fight. And he did that close to, schedulally speaking, close to fighting Alexander Usyk. And that was to keep Tyson Fury active and not be ring rusty for his fight coming up versus Alexander Usyk, and that is of even a bigger magnitude for the legitimizing sake, the purity sake of the sport. And Francis Ngannou, because of how well he performed versus Tyson Fury in his debut fight, was it luck? Was it poor preparation on the part of Tyson Fury? And that's why if he gets a fight versus a decorated former heavyweight champion like Anthony Joshua, it would be a way for Francis Ngannou to prove himself and further cement himself as a legitimate boxer. And that fight is scheduled to be a 10-rounder instead of a full 12-round fight that Anthony Joshua is already used to fighting in. And will this be a momentum derailer for Anthony Joshua? Because Francis Ngannou, I would say, isn't as much of an experienced fighter as a Otto Wallin, Robert Helenius, or a Jermaine Franklin. Granted that Francis Ngannou is more notable than all three of those guys, maybe not in the boxing world, but to the public, he's more of a well-known figure. And that's why that fight isn't a legitimate boxing match for Anthony Joshua to take on with this current win streak that he got going on right now and the signs of improvements that he's showing in his latest fights. And it's more of a money-grabbing fight for Anthony Joshua than for him to catapult himself to a future possible heavyweight title shot. A more legitimate candidate opponent for Anthony Joshua's next fight would be a guy like Joseph Parker. They had a close competitive fight when they had fought. And I wouldn't mind seeing a rematch, especially after the fight that I saw with Parker and Wilder. And then Anthony Joshua and Joseph Parker, with both guys making adjustments to their games from their first fight. If they were to fight again, I would like to see those adjustments coming into play if they were to fight for a second time. And then there's also Zhao Zhang, who's the current WBO interim heavyweight champion, and he's a strong candidate to challenge the winner of the Fury-Usyk fight, whoever walks out of that fight as the undisputed heavyweight champion next month. And then there's Filip Hrgovic, who was featured on this card as well, and he had a successful first-round knockout win. And that fight would be a tough test for Anthony Joshua to take on a fighter who's currently undefeated and is technically skilled like a Hrgovic. And it would be a tough test for Hrgovic as well, and by far the toughest test in Hrgovic's career. And he's a prospect that's on the come up, that's trying to keep his undefeated streak going while Joshua's trying to keep his momentum going. And if those two were to clash, it would be a tough test for Anthony Joshua and the fundamental improvements that he's been showing in his recent fights, and then for Filip Hrgovic to take on a well-decorated, well-experienced, and one of the biggest heavyweight names in all of boxing right now. And that's a name a up-and-coming prospect would like to have a victory over on his resume, and that would legitimize Hrgovic more than he already is, and would line himself up for a possible undisputed heavyweight title shot in the future. And Hrgovic, his fight's being featured on the Zone, and the Zone working closely with Matchroom, which is the promotion that Anthony Joshua works with. And I think Hrgovic is promoted by Matchroom as well, that would be an in-house fight, which means that would be an easy fight to make happen. And it would be one of the most legitimate fights that the sport of boxing can produce right now out of the heavyweight division. And both fighters would be putting a lot on the line if they was to have a fight in the ring. And then there's also another heavyweight fighter that Anthony Joshua can fight that's highly ranked by all the title organizations amongst the top 10 heavyweights. And that's a guy like Daniel Dubois, who also had a victory in this fight. And he got to challenge for the unified heavyweight title prior to getting a win over on Jarrell Miller on the same card. And he looked impressive in that fight, which I'm going to talk about later on during this video. That fight would be a good attraction bout domestically, locally out there in the UK, with both guys being from the UK. And because they looked impressive in that same night, that fight would be of a huge magnitude and importance as well. And the winner of that fight would legitimize themselves, not only because they're already well-known names out there, but for them to line themselves up for another possible title shot in the future. And if both guys that are as experienced and as reputable as both Anthony Joshua and Daniel Dubois, if they was to step in the ring to fight each other, they would be putting a lot on the line as well, because they are ranked high amongst the top of the heavyweights. Now, let's talk about the co-main event that we saw with Deontay Wilder versus Joseph Parker. This fight, I was expecting this fight to be competitive as well, experience-wise speaking, and as well as on paper, because they look quite even on paper. Despite the fact that Deontay Wilder had more than a year off, and that fight prior to fighting Joseph Parker, when he fought Robert Helenius, which didn't even last a full round, that's why the ring rust for Deontay Wilder could have been much more than just over a year. And that was a statement maker for Deontay Wilder when he knocked out Robert Helenius in the first round. That made Deontay Wilder look like the old Deontay Wilder that fans are accustomed to seeing Deontay Wilder perform, like the way Deontay Wilder is known to perform. And that's how he built his reputation, by finishing his opponents early, knocking them out with highlight reel knockouts. And that's what we saw in Deontay Wilder's last fight versus Robert Helenius. And it happened in the first round. It didn't even last 2 minutes. And Deontay Wilder, that performance that he put on versus Robert Helenius prior to fighting Joseph Parker, on the flip side of it, technically speaking, we didn't see any adjustments and fundamental skills displayed from Deontay Wilder. And Deontay Wilder, much like Anthony Joshua, has been criticized for his lack of fundamentals. And he was more known for his sheer raw power for knocking guys out. And you look at his fight versus Luis Ortiz, and he showed technical flaws in that fight. Prior to knocking out Luis Ortiz, he was behind on the scorecards. And then you look at the fight where he went the distance versus Berman Stavern in their first fight, and he didn't look so good in that first fight versus Berman Stavern, hence why he had to rematch Burmester Vern. And then his fight versus Tyson Fury, their first fight at least, if it weren't for those knockdowns, Tyson Fury would have walked away the winner. And even though Deontay Wilder scored those 2 knockdowns versus Tyson Fury in their first fight, on my scorecards, I had Tyson Fury winning that fight. And I'm talking about the first fight. And we saw what happened in the second and third fight when Deontay Wilder fought Tyson Fury. And I'm not going to talk about the size advantage that Tyson Fury had over a skinny guy like Deontay Wilder. Deontay Wilder has the athleticism and agility advantage over Tyson Fury, who is built sloppy, but he makes up for his body with his technical abilities. And when Deontay Wilder stepped in there versus a well-rounded fighter like Tyson Fury, we saw he was outmatched. And his bounce-back fight from those 2 losses that he suffered versus Tyson Fury was versus Robert Helenius. As I had mentioned the factors about Robert Helenius when I was talking about the fight with Anthony Joshua and Otto Wallin. And Deontay Wilder didn't prove anything in that fight when it comes to his technical abilities. He showed that he still has power in his hands and he can knock out much bigger guys than him in the heavyweight division, because weight-wise, Deontay Wilder is a small guy when it comes to body weight. And guys that he fights is 40, 50 pounds heavier than him, yet he's still able to knock his opponents out regardless of the size factor. And he still proved the fact that he earned that reputation by knocking guys out, and he still upholds his reputation by proving that he could still knock guys out at heavyweight. But when it comes to his fundamentals, unlike Anthony Joshua, we haven't seen a lot of proof on that part from Deontay Wilder. And this was a prime example. And I'm talking about this fight because Deontay Wilder pretty much was shut out in this fight. And I think 2 of the judges had this fight scored a shutout in favor of Joseph Parker, while 1 of the judges had Deontay Wilder winning 2 rounds. I could see either the opening round and the final round being scored in favor of Deontay Wilder, because both of those rounds could have been scored either ways because it wasn't that active. All the other rounds, without a question, without a shadow of a doubt, was Joseph Parker. And I personally had this fight score 11 rounds to 1, 119 to 109 in favor of Joseph Parker. Only the opening round I scored in favor of Deontay Wilder because that was a feel-out process of a round. And neither fighters was active in the opening round. And then from the second round and on, it was all Joseph Parker. Joseph Parker was able to cut off the ring, and he dictated the pace of the fight. He was able to control the range of the fight. He was able to control the space, and he was more active. He stayed busy, and he had Deontay Wilder kept at certain spots. And when he had Deontay Wilder trapped, Joseph Parker put in enough good work at Deontay Wilder with no answers back from Deontay Wilder. He was able to keep Deontay Wilder gunshot. And Deontay Wilder, he was more hesitant than we were used to seeing him. I guess after Joseph Parker got in his groove and started to get more comfortable, Deontay Wilder started respecting the power that Joseph Parker possessed. And Deontay Wilder, he showed that he could stay elusive. He showed that he could maneuver, and he didn't show such good skills when it came to that because Joseph Parker was successful at keeping them locked at certain spots in the ring, and Deontay Wilder wasn't mobile enough to keep Joseph Parker off of him. And for him to be able to do that, he would have to throw shots, yet Deontay Wilder was gun-shy throughout the whole fight. He didn't cement his foot to the canvas to let off his shots, and that is what made Joseph Parker be able to go on the offense throughout the entirety of the fight. And Deontay Wilder, the only time he showed any signs of desperateness was when he would get hit with significant blows. And even then, Joseph Parker was getting the better of the exchange. And Deontay Wilder threw meaningless punches throughout the majority of the fight. He didn't throw jabs with any meanings for him to work off of. And that's why the maneuvering around the ring that Deontay Wilder was backpedaling throughout the whole fight wasn't paying any dividends because he didn't follow that up with any shots to stop Joseph Parker at his tracks. And Joseph Parker, this was one of his most defining and impressive victories because he got a win over on a reputable name, a former champion like Deontay Wilder, and this should catapult Joseph Parker to elevate amongst the top of the heavyweights. And now that calls for Joseph Parker to have more marketable fights out there for his next fight in the future. Now, Joseph Parker is on a 4-fight win streak, and he had 2 decision wins, including this one, and then 2 knockout wins prior to fighting Deontay Wilder after he was knocked out himself versus Joe Joyce in his last defeat. And Joe Joyce, he also suffered back-to-back knockout losses in his last 2 fights, and he's trying to look for a bounce-back fight to have. And with this current momentum that Joseph Parker has right now, after getting what is considered to be his biggest win in his pro boxing career, I'm sure Joseph Parker would like to avenge that loss that he suffered versus Joe Joyce. And Joe Joyce, as I have said, is going to want to try and get back amongst the top of the heavyweight rankings in the heavyweight division. And when Joseph Parker and Joe Joyce fought, they had a good fight prior to Joe Joyce defeating Joseph Parker in that fight in that dramatic fashion in the 11th round when they had fought. And then Joseph Parker's other 2 losses came from versus Anthony Joshua, and that was a close competitive bout as well. And I had mentioned a fight with Anthony Joshua and Joseph Parker would be a lucrative fight for both fighters with the current win streak that both fighters got going on right now. And then his other defeat came from versus Dillian White, who is well past his prime, and that would be the least lucrative bout for Joseph Parker to have if he were to rematch any of these fighters who he had lost to. And another good fight that would be for Joseph Parker would be a fight versus Filip Hrgovic, as I had mentioned, was featured and successful in getting a first-round knockout in his fight on this card. That would be a tough test for both Joseph Parker and Filip Hrgovic, and that would be a good competitive bout on paper as well. And it would mean a lot on the line for both fighters if they was to step and face off with one another, and they would cement themselves further to be legitimized to get a possible title shot in the future. And The next fight that was featured on the card that I'll be talking about was for the WBA and IBO light heavyweight title, a fight between Dimtry Bivol and Lyndon Arthur. And Lyndon Arthur defended the IBO light heavyweight title, and he won the vacant IBO light heavyweight title in his last fight versus Brian Suarez. And Lyndon Arthur isn't that well known, not only amongst the boxing fans, but in the light heavyweight division as well, because you look at the rankings when it comes to the sanctioning bodies, 3 out of the 4 title organizations that's considered to be major doesn't have Lyndon Arthur amongst the top 10 light heavyweight contenders other than the WBO. The WBO has Lyndon Arthur ranked at number 9. And Dimtry Bivol is the WBA light heavyweight champion. This fight, to make it meaningful for Dimtry Bivol, who had more than a year off from being active in boxing, they had to put another title on the line to keep that momentum that Dimtry Bivol had going on prior to taking this long hiatus. And Dimtry Bivol, you look at his last 2 previous fights prior to this fight versus Lyndon Arthur, was versus the cash cow of the sport, arguably the most well-recognized name in all of boxing, that being Canelo Alvarez, the current undisputed super middleweight champion. And Dimtry Bivol won that fight cleanly and decisively. And then Dimtry Bivol goes on to defend his WBA light heavyweight championship versus Gilberto Ramirez. And when he fought Zerto, who is well recognized and a decorated fighter as well, a well-accomplished one as well, a well-recognized one as well, and that fights at a higher level than Lyndon Arthur. That's 2 back-to-back hard fights that Dimtry Bivol fought and successfully defended his WBA light heavyweight title against. And for his comeback fight to have that same kind of feel, they would have to put another title list in there with Dimtry Bivol. Now, I know the IBO isn't recognized the same as the WBA titles, but it's on a higher recognition than a local domestic title like a NABF or whatever continental titles or any other Mickey Mouse paper belts that's a different title for a title for these sanctioning bodies out there. And Dimtry Bivol, this was a expected performance that he put on versus Lyndon Arthur. I had this fight score a shutout, 12 rounds to none, 120 to 107, including the knockdown that he scored in the later rounds. And that goes to show y'all that this fight was one-sided. Dimtry Bivol won all 12 rounds. And Dimtry Bivol, the next step that would make sense for him would be to fight the winner of Arthur Beterbiev and Callum Smith. That fight is next week for the unified WBC, IBF, and WBO light heavyweight titles. Arthur Beterbiev also being from Russia, which is where Dimtry Bivol is from as well. And he's been earning himself a reputation. He's undefeated, a unified light heavyweight champion right now, who's had all his victories come via knockout. And a record like that is what draws attention for not only boxing fans, but the public will draw to a record, a resume like the one that Arthur Beterbiev has. And Arthur Beterbiev fighting Callum Smith, who's been in there with the likes of Canelo Alvarez. He's also fought a well-recognized name who's well-known out there locally in England as well, and that being John Ryder. And he had a victory over on John Ryder. And Callum Smith having these notable fights that he's had in his career makes him a recognized name, one of the more recognizable names that Arthur Beterbiev will face in his pro boxing career. And if Arthur Beterbiev, which most likely he should walk away the victor of that fight, gets a win over on Callum Smith in an impressive manner, then I would say a undisputed light heavyweight title fight would be the next step to make. And since there is all these undisputed title fights happening all throughout boxing, I say this is the next fight to make happen, and it would be of a big stature as well. And you could have this fight hosted anywhere, whether it be in the Eastern Hemisphere or the Western Hemisphere, is going to call for hopefully what is a good turnout of a event that we see produced out of a possible undisputed light heavyweight fight between the two light heavyweight champions at that division. If not Arthur Beterbiev is already going to have a tough test for him next week versus Callum Smith for his light heavyweight titles. Now, Dimtry Bivol, who's been fighting higher quality opponents than Arthur Beterbiev, unless you don't want to count that fight versus Joe Smith, where Arthur Beterbiev looked like a monster versus Joe Smith in his previous fight, where he won the WBO light heavyweight title off of Joe Smith from, and he got that victory via an early knockout win. And Joe Smith, being a former champion, and Dimtry Bivol already defeated Joe Smith prior to Arthur Beterbiev capturing the WBO light heavyweight title from Joe Smith when they fought. And Dimtry Bivol didn't beat Joe Smith as emphatically as Arthur Beterbiev, but he outskilled and outboxed Joe Smith for their fight that they had when they fought. And Dimtry Bivol, he fought Canelo Alvarez, as I mentioned, and Gilberto Ramirez, who are two high caliber of opponents to fight. And he took a year off, more than that actually, and then he fights Lyndon Arthur to rush that ring rust off of him. And it didn't look like he missed any steps. It looked like he had a good, proper training camp. And this fight was designed, stylistically speaking, to make Dimtry Bivol look good and to add another title to him. Now, I know boxing is a risky sport where a fight could turn out any way, and luckily for Dimtry Bivol, no upsets was pulled, and Dimtry Bivol was able to easily cruise to a unanimous decision win. And Dimtry Bivol fluctuated very well. He had a good flow, a consistent one throughout all 12 rounds. And he didn't gas out. He didn't show any signs of lacking when it came to stamina. He still is accurate with his shots, and he's precise, and he places his punches very well together, and his skills are still looking top tier. And that's what you look for in a reputable champion like Dimtry Bivol. Anyways, moving on. I'm going to be talking about the fight with Jai Opetaia and Ellis Zorro. And this fight, there wasn't a lot to talk about because this fight ended in the first round with Jai Opetaia scoring a first round knockout win. It was one of the best knockouts produced out of the year 2023. Jai Opetaia hit Ellis Zorro with a feint jab to the body, making Ellis Zorro's guard go down, and Jai Opetaia would score a overhand right hand that would devastate Ellis Zorro and floor him for Jai Opetaia to score a knockout win in the first round. And I could talk about what happened prior to this fight actually happening. Jai Opetaia, who's considered and recognized as the best and the most noticeable cruiserweight in the cruiserweight division. Now, the cruiserweight division isn't as lively in competition when compared to other weight classes. And reputation-wise speaking, honestly, Lawrence Okolie is more recognized than Jai Opetaia. But when you look at their resume, Jai Opetaia, without a shadow of a doubt, is the better fighter and should be regarded as the best cruiserweight when it comes to cruiserweight boxing. And he was supposed to defend the IBF cruiserweight title, and that title he won when he upsetted the boxing fans by defeating Marius Bredis. And that was one of the biggest upsets of that year when that fight happened. And that's what put Jai Opetaia on the map. And the IBF was requesting for another fight for Jai Opetaia to have versus Marius Bredis. It makes sense, marketably speaking, because as I have said, the cruiserweight division isn't that lively when it comes to attention being paid to boxing overall. And Jai Opetaia, you look at Elizoro, who isn't that much of a familiar name because he hasn't fought as much as a Marius Bredis. And Jai Opetaia had rejected the want that the IBF had asked of him, and that's to rematch Marius Bredis. And that's why he vacated the IBF cruiserweight title, and that was a title that he was supposed to defend versus Elizoro. And I look at the current rankings of the cruiserweight division right now. There's no current unified cruiserweight champion. There's an undefeated French fighter who fights locally in France. His name is Arsene Goulamarian. He's 27-0, but as I have said, he only fights locally out there in France. He doesn't go to other parts of Europe like England, where they got more of a healthier boxing scene, or even a Germany, where they got enthusiasm for the sport of boxing, I would say, more than they do in France. And that's the current WBA cruiserweight champion. And then the WBC cruiserweight champion is Noel Mikaelian. He competed in the World Boxing Super Series tournament when the cruiserweight division was having a tournament, and Marius Bredis was a part of that tournament as well, as was Alexander Usyk, and that's how Usyk became the undisputed cruiserweight champion, and then he moved up to heavyweight. And Marius Bredis, still to this day, I'll say, other than the fight with Derek Chisora, posed the toughest challenge for Alexander Usyk in Usyk's pro boxing career. And Marius Bredis has a decision win over on Noel Mikaelian, and that happened in the quarterfinals of that tournament. And then his other defeat came from Krzysztof Woldakov. I can't pronounce this guy's name, but boxing fans know who I'm talking about because this guy was a well-known name amongst the cruiserweight division. He was considered a veteran who's been fighting amongst the top of the cruiserweights for a while when he was active and in his prime of his career. And this Polish fighter is still active, even though he's not taking on as much of fierce competitors as in the past. And he was a part of the Cruiserweight World Boxing Super Series tournament as well. And that fight where Michaela lost versus Krzysztof, well, I'm not even going to try and pronounce his name. Y'all know who I'm talking about. That was a split decision loss. And he defeated Makabu, who lost to Badou Jack for the WBC Cruiserweight title. And after Badou Jack vacated the WBC Cruiserweight title, Makabu and Noel Mikhailov fought for the vacant WBC Cruiserweight title, and Mikhailov walked away successful in that fight. And then the WBO cruiserweight champion is Chris Billiam Smith, who pulled off that upset victory over on Lawrence Okolie to become the new WBO cruiserweight champion. And I'm sure Jai Opetaia would like to challenge any of the champions in the cruiserweight division. And as I had said before, Jai Opetaia still is the lineal cruiserweight champion and is regarded as the best cruiserweight in the cruiserweight division by many, if not majority, of boxing outlets. Now, I'd like to see what direction Jai Opetaia is going to head towards for the future, because he turned down a fight versus who's been considered to be the best cruiserweight for a while now, and I'm talking about Marius Bredis. If he turned down what is the most lucrative and sensible and marketable fight for him, which would be another fight versus Marius Bredis, what fight would Jai Opetaia and his team would like to take on next? And I look at the top 10 contenders of the cruiserweight division. Majority of these names are not that well known. So if Jai Opetaia decides to have a local fight where he's from in Australia somewhere, then he can have fights there where he could have local support, but it won't be of a big magnitude with a title fight feel to it. The next fight I'm going to be talking about is the fight with Daniel Dubois and Jarrell Miller. Now, both fighters was talking all kinds of ish to each other, and it had media hype prior to this fight because of all the outside of the ring ish talk that they was having for one another. Even though this fight was one of the feature bouts, even though on paper it looked even, because both fighters had a reputation and as well as a importance for both fighters to gain momentum prior to actually fighting. And Daniel Dubois, after his loss versus Alexander Usyk, this was a good comeback performance for Daniel Dubois, and he did that versus a recognizable name like Jarrell Miller. And other than the fourth round, Daniel Dubois won all the other rounds. And this fight didn't go to the judges' hands because Daniel Dubois in the final round was able to score a TKO win over on Jarrell Miller with flurries of onslaught of combinations of punches, and Jarrell Miller was out on his feet. Jarrell Miller showed good durability, good endurance with his ability to absorb shots, but he was out on his feet and he wasn't throwing nothing back. And that's what called for the referee to step in and call a halt to the bout. And Daniel Dubois, he displayed good fluidity in this fight, good combination work, and good flow, good ring generalship, and he had a good rhythm, and he was accurate with his shots, and he was busy. His work rate kept Jarrell Miller off of him. And other than Jarrell Miller closing that gap and landing some significant blows at Daniel Dubois, where Daniel Dubois looked like he was on the verge of getting knocked out, other than that moment, it was all Daniel Dubois, and this was a brilliant comeback performance for Daniel Dubois. And now Daniel Dubois, after a bounce-back performance like that, catapulted himself to a higher level amongst from top 20 to top 10 heavyweights in the heavyweight division. And I forgot to mention this when it comes to possible future opponents with Dmitry Bivol. If that undisputed light heavyweight title fight with Bivol And Beterbiev isn't immediate. He could fight Dan Aziz, who's a undefeated, up-and-coming prospect out of the UK. He's ranked number 2 by the WBA, and that's the light heavyweight title that Dmitry Bivol holds. And the other top-ranked contender, he's actually ranked number 1 by the WBA, and his name is Joshua Buatsi. He's been making a splash and an impact as of late because he's more known than Dan Aziz. Both fighters are undefeated, young and up and coming, both from the UK, and both ranked number 1 and 2 by the WBA. And unlike Dan Aziz, he travels more than Joshua Buatsi. Joshua Buatsi has been making more of a name for himself out there locally in the UK, and I've said this many times before that the UK has the most local support and the healthiest scene for their domestic boxing, and that's why it's more easy for English fighters to gain a reputation than American fighters, because not only attendance-wise, but media coverage-wise as well, the UK media outlets tend to put more effort into covering boxing than in the Western Hemisphere, other than Latin America. And Joshua Buatsi, I think out there in the UK, his fights are aired on Sky Sports or The Zone. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know if Buatsi's fights are aired on The Zone. I think I've seen his fights from The Zone before. That's where I've previously seen Joshua Buatsi from, I believe. If I'm wrong, correct me though. However, Joshua Buatsi's name rings more of a bell than Dan Aziz, and either fights for Dmitry Bivol, whether he fights Dan Aziz or Joshua Buatsi, would be not only a tough test, but it would pick up from where Dmitry Bivol left off from that more than a year hiatus he took after defeating Gilberto Ramirez, and it would be a much tougher task in defense of his WBA light heavyweight title if he was to take on either Joshua Buatsi or Dan Aziz in his next fight. I would say that's more of a tougher challenge than Arthur Beterbiev's next fight versus Callum Smith. And Callum Smith, he may be more experienced than Joshua Buatsi or Dan Aziz, but a fighter that is as young and as green and is on the come up like Joshua Buatsi and Dan Aziz will make for a more dangerous, risky opponent for a reputable champion like Dmitry Bivol. And to uphold his reputation of being a titleist as one of the elites in all of boxing, that is a heck of a challenge, a tough one for Dmitry Bivol. It would be like taking on Saul Alvarez or Gilberto Ramirez, but the younger and more hungrier version of that, regardless of the fact that they are not as experienced and hasn't fought in big stages like a Bivol or a Alvarez or Ramirez. But a tough test nonetheless, and it would call for a good fight that is worthy of being for the WBA light heavyweight title. Next and last fight that I'm going to be talking about was the fight with Filip Hrgovic and Mori. And Mori is more like a journeyman, never heard of dude before. He's an Australian fighter, and Hrgovic made quick work of him. he, much like Jai Obatai, scored a first-round knockout, and Mori kept on turning his back. He showed that he had no interest in the fight versus Hrgovic, and Hrgovic collected yet another knockout win in his career. Hrgovic, his toughest test in his career so far was versus Zhang, where he was able to pick up a split decision win versus Zhang in what was a very competitive fight. And Hrgovic is currently ranked number 1 by the IBF, and he's well on his way to a possible future title shot. And a win versus a opponent like Mori isn't much of a statement maker, but it keeps Hrgovic active and his name surfacing amongst the relevant scene when it comes to heavyweight boxing. And I had talked about the scene of the heavyweight boxing division with the 2 main feature bouts that I had talked about at the start of the video. And Hrgovic, if he's to fight any of these well-known names amongst the top of the heavyweight contenders, would be a good look for him. Definitely would be a step up in the ladder of competition for Hrgovic if he's to fight any of the heavyweights that was featured on this card, whether it be a Dubois or even a Jarrell Miller, who took a L in this fight. And if Hrgovic can get a win versus Miller, that would be a good look for Hrgovic to have a name that is well recognized amongst heavyweight boxing. Even though Jarrell Miller isn't that well accomplished, it'll still be a good look resume-wise speaking. And if he's to fight either Otto Wallin, who lost to Anthony Joshua, it'll still be a good look for him if he gets a fight versus Otto Wallin, and even a better look if he's able to get a win over on Otto Wallin, or better yet, if he's to get a fight versus Deontay Wilder, if Deontay Wilder decides to not retire. And a more lucrative opportunity for Filip Hrgovic would be to get a fight versus either Daniel Dubois, Anthony Joshua, or Joseph Parker, who respectively individually won their fights. And that does it for this post-fight video for all the fights that I saw that happened on the card of Day of Reckoning. And as a boxing fan, I can say keep on putting on events like these, and fans are going to tune in and appreciate the effort that the promoters and the sport as a whole is putting on, because this is a card where they show effort and enthusiasm being put in, and for fans to want to tap in to the sport of boxing. And be on the lookout for a year-end review of 2023 on the next episode of Talk Boxing. That's a own podcast show that I got going on, talking about the sport of boxing. It's like a collectible of topics that I discuss on one episode. It's its own podcast. It's separate from me talking about what had happened for a individual respective fight or event. And I'm going to be talking about awards as far as fighter of the year, fight of the year, and all that old good. And subscribe to this channel, share this content, like this video if y'all want, and to show y'all support for this channel, click the links in the description. Anything will be appreciated. And that does it, man. I'm out of here. Y'all be good and peace.